Historic milestone. Both parties agreed to continue direct negotiations at a later date. The Lebanese armed group Hezbollah, though, has dismissed the talks as futile, while Lebanon says the aim is to end Israeli attacks. Israel says it will not consider a ceasefire unless the Lebanese government takes steps to disarm Hezbollah. And despite the diplomatic push in Washington, Israeli forces continued airstrikes across southern Lebanon. Earlier, 2 vehicles were targeted in the towns of Saadiyat and Al-Jilia in Mount Lebanon. There has also been an air raid on the town of Nabatiyah Al-Fawqa in the south. Al Jazeera's Mike Hanna has more from the U.S. State Department where the talks took place.
It was the first time there was direct diplomatic contact between Lebanon and Israel in more than 3 decades. This was what was described as a preliminary meeting. It was at ambassadorial level. The discussions were intended to lay a base for future discussions which may be held at a far higher level. The meeting, though, was chaired by the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who had this to say at the beginning.
Well, this is a historic opportunity. We understand we're working against decades of history and complexities that have led us to this unique moment. And the opportunity here, I know some of you are shouting questions about ceasefires. This is a lot more than just questions about ceasefires. This is a lot more than just about that. This is about bringing a permanent end to 20 or 30 years of Hezbollah's influence in this part of the world and not just the damage it's inflicted on Israel, the damage it's inflicted on the Lebanese people. We have to remember the Lebanese people are victims of Hezbollah. The Lebanese people are victims of Iranian aggression. And this needs to stop. And so our hope here, and I know this will be a process, okay, all of the complexities of this matter are not going to be resolved in the next 6 hours, but we can begin to move forward to create the framework where something can happen, something very positive, something very permanent, so that the people of Lebanon can have the kind of future they deserve, and so that the people of Israel can live without fear and being struck.
For his part, the Israeli ambassador to the United States sounded optimistic when the meeting ended.
With the degrading of Iran, this malign and malignant entity that's trying to destabilize the entire region, there is now the opportunity to degrade its proxies as well, to move them out of their horrific occupation of another country, and to move into an era where Lebanese and Israelis can live side by side in peace. And yes, vacation in each other's countries. It's not a pipe dream. It's a reality that can really happen in our lifetime.
For her part, the Lebanese ambassador, Nada Hamadeh Moawad, issued a statement on social media describing this meeting as constructive. She said that she called for a ceasefire and the return of displaced persons to their home. She said she also urged concrete steps to alleviate the severe humanitarian crisis the country continues to face. There has been a joint statement issued as well, saying that the date and venue of the next meeting will be announced at a later time. So no full confirmation that there will be a follow-up meeting, but every implication that there will be, but the date, the location still to be announced. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera at the State Department.
Zaina Khodar is live for us in Beirut. So Zaina, is it clear what constructive result Lebanese diplomats feel came out of this talk, since the Israeli occupation is continuing its strikes in Lebanon?
Well, there's more uncertainty. Lebanon's ambassador did say the talks were constructive, but at the same time, she said she called for a ceasefire. She called for residents who were forcibly displaced from their homes to return. Israel is not interested in a ceasefire, and they've made that very, very clear. Really, both sides entered the talks with differing agendas. For Lebanon, this is about ending attacks. It's about ending Israel's occupation of Lebanese territory, about releasing prisoners who are in Israel at the time being. But for Israel, this is a path to disarm Hezbollah. That's the way they're framing this whole process. And really the words of Israel's ambassador, we together, united, really showing as if the Lebanese government is its partner, is going to cause further divisions in this country. He talks about fighting Hezbollah together, the threat of Hezbollah. He talks about liberating Lebanon from Iran's occupation. So for Israel and the United States, these talks were about weakening Hezbollah. These talks were about weakening Iran's influence over Lebanon. More importantly for them, this was about separating the Iranian and Lebanese fronts, because Iran had insisted Lebanon is included in any regional ceasefire deal. Now, in that joint statement, the U.S. saying any deal, any cessation of hostilities will have to be negotiated between Lebanon and Israel and brokered by the United States. So really more uncertainty, with people really not knowing where this conflict is heading.
And Zaina, how much of a question mark hangs over the meaningfulness of these talks when Hezbollah has already said it's not going to abide by anything agreed, right?
Well, yes, there are internal divisions in the country, and when there's a lack of consensus in Lebanon, any deal cannot be implemented. Yes, Hezbollah has been weakened, but it still has members in parliament, it still has ministers in government, and it still has support in the street, and it still has arms. And it has told the Lebanese government to cooperate with it, because they believe the Lebanese government will have more leverage if, quote, the resistance and the government put their hands together. They believe the government doesn't have leverage. They blame the government for not being able to force Israel to abide by the 2024 ceasefire deal. Instead, that was a one-sided deal, and Israel continued to carry out strikes. People were not able to return to their homes. Any attempt at reconstruction in the south of the country was targeted. So Hezbollah making clear what it wants. Really, both sides are still negotiating under fire. We've had those talks in Washington. It's more of a photo opportunity. The real negotiations are still being conducted under fire. Israeli strikes continue. In the past hour, two vehicles were targeted along a coastal highway just 25 kilometers south of Beirut.
And that's Zaina Khudr for us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Tony Cheng is following the Israeli government's reaction. He joins us now from the Jordanian capital, Amman. So what are Israeli officials saying about these talks?
Well, I think there was an expectation that Hezbollah would increase its attacks on northern Israel in the aftermath of these talks, and that appears to be the case. We've seen Israeli army radio reporting more than 40 rockets launched at various sites across the Galilee region, even as far south as Haifa. Most of those have been intercepted. Some have fallen onto empty ground. They report in the city of Tamra, they say 160 in the Israeli press. The Times of Israel recognizes that there is a huge gulf between the two sides, the Israelis and the Lebanese, and it says that it can only really come to a conclusion once the ties between Iran and Hezbollah have been completely broken. Haaretz cites sources close to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who they say is using this negotiation as a maneuver to buy time to continue his offensive in southern Lebanon, while at the same time keep demonstrating to Washington D.C. a certain amount of goodwill, that particularly after phone calls with President Trump last week, which were described as tense. But I think you can also see the attitude of the Israeli ambassador to Washington D.C., who in Mike Hanna's report was talking about people from both sides of the border crossing on vacation. Well, of course, there are more than 1 million people who have now been evacuated from southern Lebanon. They're looking for an immediate ceasefire, and that doesn't appear to be happening anytime soon.
And that is Tony Cheng reporting to us from Amman in Jordan. US Vice President J.D. Vance says Washington is pushing for a broader deal with Iran as negotiations continue under a fragile ceasefire.
The president set a policy. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and right now we are negotiating to make sure that very thing happens. And here's what's interesting about this is what's interesting about this is that we have this ceasefire that's in place. I think it's 6 or 7 days old. Ceasefire that's in place. I think it's 6 or 7 days old. Right now, the ceasefire is holding. And what you're seeing is what the president wants to make, he doesn't want to make like a small deal. He wants to make the grand bargain. And what he's basically offering to Iran is very simple, and frankly, it's something that no president has, I think, has had the ability to offer. He said that if you're willing to act like a normal country, we are willing to treat you economically like a normal country. He doesn't want a small deal. And that's one of the reasons why, one, I'd say in Pakistan, we made a ton of progress. But the reason why the deal is not yet done is because the president, he really wants a deal where Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, Iran is not state sponsoring terrorism, but also the people of Iran can thrive and prosper and join the world economy.
And Chris Doyle is a commentator on Middle East affairs and the director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding. He joins us live now from London. Good to have you with us. So let's start first of all with the prospect of another round of talks between the US and Iran. Is any reason to believe that a further round would be more productive? Have we seen any indication of a change in position of either side?
There hasn't been a change of position in public, but I think that both sides understand that it is ultimately in their interest to reach a deal. It's interesting to hear the US Vice President, J.D. Vance, talking about getting to a big deal, because that is also something that Iran wants. Iran does not want to have some temporary ceasefire deal or a deal that falls apart in 6 months with yet another war. And that would also suit, for example, the Gulf states as well. So that is perhaps on the positive side. Of course, it will take longer to secure such a longer deal. There's going to be more fine-tuning of any agreement than there would be on an enhanced ceasefire deal. But of course, there remains massive gaps, a huge gap in trust, of course. Notably, we see it on the issue of enriched uranium. We see it on the issue of Lebanon. We see it on the Strait of HORMUZ. What are the conditions in the Strait of HORMUZ? What are the conditions by which Iran would agree to end its blockade and the US would agree to end its counter blockade of that? So I think that everyone will be happy if there are further talks, but let's hope that they can go in there with some revised ideas and thinking to narrow the chasm between the two sides.
Chris, you mentioned it'll take longer. How does that sit with Donald Trump's comments that the war is very close to over?
Well, there's one thing saying the war is over. There's another thing saying that there is a war is over. There's another thing saying that there is a full peace deal to be signed. I think that for Trump, in the short term, this ceasefire period has worked quite well for him because he was under immense pressure when the war was going on. You saw the huge devastation and damage to partners in the Gulf, including the targeting of energy infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, of course, missile attacks on Israel as well. At least this has bought him a little bit of breathing space. But he knows ultimately that unless he manages to get the Strait of Hormuz open and the flow of energy and other vital materials and products into the world market, he is going to be held accountable by his own electorate because they see the rise of prices, they see the economic impact. So he needs to go beyond just that ceasefire. Of course, the joker
Chris,
in all of this...
I'm trying to piece together what you're saying then. If on the one hand you're saying there's a difference between a war and a deal, but he's under pressure to open the Strait of Hormuz. So can he effectively keep this kind of situation of there isn't fighting, but there isn't a deal going on for too long?
Well, I think that this is the view of the Trump administration, that by doing this, that blockade on Iran means there's huge pressures now on Iran to try to break out of this blockade, because increasingly what we are seeing is they can't export their oil and gas. So their storage facilities are running out. They're going to be hit economically. So actually, it drives Iran closer to a situation where they're a little bit more desperate to get a deal as well. And if both sides
how do we know
really
that, Chris?
wanting it,
we don't know exactly where the naval blockade line starts, right? That's one of the issues with the CENTCOM announcement. So how do we know how effective the US blockade really is? There have been reports of Chinese ships, Iranian ships, a Panama-registered tanker moving out or in of the Strait of HORMUZ, but we don't know where the blockade line really begins to say that the blockade is effective or isn't.
I quite agree. I think there is so much doubt, and you saw this difference between what the president has stated, that it will be a full blockade on all ships from Iran, but then CENTCOM coming out and, being rather more specific about what the blockade would be and how many ships have got past. So I was referring to how the Trump administration tries to portray things, how it sees things. I think if they can at least restrict the amount of oil and gas that Iran is able to export, then they will believe that it'll mount that pressure. But, this is not really the way this is all going to end. It has to be diplomacy. Both sides have to look as to how they are going to modify their negotiating positions, come up with some creative ideas as to how to get themselves out of a losing position, because neither side is winning in this. They are both losing, no matter what they say in public, however they try to portray it to their own domestic audiences.
And on the talks that have taken place between Israel and Lebanon, what have they achieved, do you think, other than demonstrating perhaps that the Lebanon-Israel dynamic is not linked to the Iranian-US-Israel front?
For sure, they're trying to decouple it from the US-Iran front. Of course, Iran may take a different view. This was a key issue earlier for Iran, that it was not going to abandon its ally Hezbollah, and had insisted that there had to be a ceasefire in Lebanon. Now, I think what we have seen is Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has bought some time with these talks. He has allowed a situation where he can continue to prosecute his war on Lebanon with the promise of these talks, perhaps some talks in a couple of weeks' time. Who knows? We don't have a date for that. So for Netanyahu, he's achieved that. I think for the Lebanese government, they've also achieved a little bit of distinction to say that there is a huge gap between the Lebanese authorities and Hezbollah, that they are prepared to go against Hezbollah's wishes. Hezbollah was against these talks, and to have direct negotiations for the first time in decades with Israel. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. These were very low-level talks at ambassadorial levels. Both sides had radically different ideas as to what they were there to do. The Lebanese side only for a ceasefire, the Israeli side only looking at a future permanent deal between the two countries and not a ceasefire. So we have a long way to go on this. In the meantime, what really counts on the ground is Israel is still bombing Lebanon, still hitting targets. Hezbollah is hit with rockets as well. So